June 2, 1982. Estadio Sarriá, Barcelona. Argentina and Brazil were 70 minutes away from a result that would determine which of them advanced toward the World Cup semifinals. And Diego Maradona was 70 minutes away from a decision that would define how much of his early international career people chose to remember. Argentina had come to Spain as the defending champions. The 1978 title had been won at home, in a tournament that the Argentine military government had treated as a public relations event as much as a sporting competition. The victory stood in the record books, but the context around it had kept the conversation about that team running for years. By the summer of 1982, Argentina was also engaged in a military conflict with Britain over the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. The war had begun in April and was still active when the squad departed for Spain. The players were preparing for football, while the country behind them was losing soldiers. The Argentine Football Federation and the government both understood that the national team's performance in Spain carried significance that extended past any scoreline. Maradona had been 17 years old when Argentina won in 1978. Cesar Luis Menotti, the head coach, had left him out of the final squad selection. Maradona had been considered by most people who had watched him play at that age to be the most naturally gifted young footballer in the country, and Menotti's decision was discussed at length in Argentina both before and after the tournament. Maradona spent that summer watching his country win the championship from outside the squad. He did not speak often about the experience in the years that followed, but the omission was part of his story in a way that did not fade. 4 years later in Spain, he was no longer an outside possibility. He was the player the team was organized around, the one opposition coaches spent the most preparation time addressing, and the one Argentine supporters looked to first when the match became difficult. Brazil were the team most observers in that tournament had found difficult to look away from. Tele Santana's squad moved the ball with a consistency and creativity that made their first-round matches genuinely unusual to watch. Zico was the most technically precise player on the field in nearly every game he entered. Socrates covered ground with a stride that seemed unhurried until you measured the distances. Falcão and Eder filled out a unit that had scored 10 first-round goals without conceding once. The rivalry between Argentina and Brazil had been producing charged matches for decades. It did not require a World Cup to feel significant, but a World Cup gave it a frame that made everything inside it larger. At Estadio Sarriá, on a warm afternoon in early June, the stadium was full and the kickoff was approaching. Before the final whistle, Maradona would find himself at the center of a moment that no one in the Argentine dugout had planned for. The match began at a pace that reflected what both teams understood was at stake. Argentina needed a result. Brazil, having won their first-round group without conceding, came into the game with a shape and a confidence that showed in how quickly they moved the ball in the opening minutes. Their midfield did not hold possession cautiously. They circulated it with purpose, pulling Argentina's lines apart with short combinations before switching the point of attack. Within the first 10 minutes, it was clear that Argentina would spend significant portions of this match defending. Maradona was positioned to receive the ball in tight spaces, as he almost always was, and Brazil's defenders and midfielders made sure he had company every time it arrived. Luizinho and Falcão tracked his movement across the midfield line. When he dropped deep to collect, a Brazilian player dropped with him. When he turned and drove forward, a challenge arrived before he could build momentum. The attention was not accidental. It was organized and consistent, the kind of defensive preparation that comes from watching film carefully and making a collective decision about which problem to solve first. Brazil opened the scoring early in the second half. A combination through the center of the field released Zico into space, and his finish was precise. The Argentine defense had been compact for most of the first half, but the goal came through the exact kind of movement Santana's team had been attempting repeatedly. Patient circulation followed by a single sharp exchange that opened the line. Argentina responded. Ramon Diaz equalized not long after, and for a period the match opened up in a way that gave both teams genuine chances. Maradona found brief moments, a turn in midfield, a short exchange that moved him into a better position. But the consistency he showed in league football, where a single half-second of hesitation from a defender could create something significant, was harder to produce here. The Brazilian players were too organized and too quick to recover. As the match progressed and the Brazilian pressure rebuilt, the physical dimension of the game became more pronounced. The challenges on Maradona grew more direct, players arriving late, contact that the referee assessed differently from how the Argentine players on the receiving end experienced it. Maradona said nothing visible to the officials, but his body language between plays was changing. Shorter responses to teammates, a tightness in how he moved between stoppages that had not been present in the first half. Brazil scored again, and then again. By the time the scoreline had moved to 3-1, Argentina were playing catch-up in a match they did not have the depth to reverse. Maradona was still on the field, still receiving the ball, still attempting to find a way through a Brazilian defensive structure that had controlled the afternoon almost entirely. He was running out of time. And then came the challenge that pushed him past it. The challenge that ended Maradona's afternoon came in the 85th minute. Batista had fouled him earlier in the match, a tackle that had drawn a yellow card and done nothing to reduce the physical pressure on Maradona in the time that followed. Now, deep into stoppage of a game that Argentina had already effectively lost, Maradona received the ball near the center circle and was challenged again. What happened in the seconds that followed was visible to everyone in the stadium and to the television cameras positioned around the field. Maradona kicked out. His boot connected with Batista's groin. The contact was deliberate, and it was not subtle. It was the kind of act that happens when a player has absorbed physical pressure across 80-plus minutes and reaches a point where the calculation that normally prevents such things stops working. Batista went down. The players around the moment stopped. The referee, Mario Rubio of Mexico, was close enough to have a clear view of what had occurred. He reached for the red card immediately. There was no extended discussion, no consultation with a linesman. Rubio raised the card directly, and Maradona, who had not attempted to dispute what he had done, turned and walked toward the touchline. The Argentine players in the immediate vicinity moved toward the referee, not with genuine expectation of a reversal, but with the reflexive protest that follows a sending off. Brazilian players stood back. Some of them had seen the act clearly and offered no objection to the decision. Maradona walked the length of the field to the tunnel. The crowd at Estadio Sarriá, a stadium that held approximately 45,000 people and was close to capacity for this match, reacted with the kind of noise that comes when something unexpected has clarified itself suddenly. This was a World Cup quarterfinal round match. Argentina were the defending champions, and their central player had just been sent off in the 85th minute for retaliating against a defender who had been fouling him with varying degrees of severity since the opening whistle. Argentina finished the match with 10 players. The final score was 3-1. The result eliminated them from the tournament. In the dressing room afterward, the Argentine players processed both things simultaneously, the defeat and the absence that had preceded it. Maradona had left the field before the result was confirmed, but the result would have been the same either way. Brazil were the better team that day by a margin that one player, even this one, could not have reversed. The red card was the moment the cameras stayed on, the moment that anchored the match in memory once the tournament moved forward. It was the first World Cup sending off of Maradona's career, and it arrived at a point when he had been in the tournament long enough to carry the full weight of Argentine expectations and not long enough to have delivered anything that met them. What it meant for him going forward was a question that would take 4 more years to answer. The final minutes played out with Argentina in a shape they had not prepared for. 10 players, 3 goals behind, in a second-round World Cup match against a Brazilian team that had no reason to press further once the result was decided. Brazil moved the ball without urgency. Argentine players tracked back and held their positions. There was nothing left to chase. When Mario Rubio blew the final whistle, the players walked off the field in the way that players do after a result that has not been close. In small groups, without much conversation, some with their shirts already pulled away from their shoulders. The Argentine supporters in the stands were quiet in the way that follows not just a loss, but a specific kind of loss, the kind where the scoreline is only part of what happened. Maradona was already inside by the time the whistle went. He had been in the dressing room for several minutes, which is a long time to sit with a decision that cannot be undone while the match is still being played outside. In the days after Argentina's elimination, the coverage in the Argentine press addressed both things together, the defeat and the sending off. But they were not treated as equivalent events. The red card was the image that anchored the accounts. Maradona's kick at Batista was replayed and reprinted and described in detail that the result itself did not receive. He was the most prominent player on the team, and he had left his team short during the closing minutes of a match that had already gone wrong. The combination was difficult to separate from how his performance in Spain was assessed overall. He had scored once in the tournament. He had been fouled repeatedly in nearly every match he entered by defenders who understood that their primary assignment was to limit what he could do, and that the physical cost of that assignment was acceptable. He had absorbed that pressure across 5 matches, and in the 85th minute of the last one, he had not absorbed it. He was 21 years old. The 1982 World Cup was his first, and it ended in a stadium in Barcelona, with him watching the final minutes from a corridor he was not allowed to return from. What followed for Maradona was not a sustained decline in standing or ability. He signed for Napoli 2 years later, and what he produced in Italy over the next 7 years placed him beyond the reach of most comparisons the sport could offer. The 1986 World Cup in Mexico would arrive, and with it the quarterfinal against England, and the 2 goals that between them contained almost everything the football world had decided to believe about him. The afternoon at Estadio Sarriá did not close anything. It was an early chapter written under circumstances that were difficult by a player who was not yet finished learning what he was capable of or what it would cost to find out.